Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one we start out in the Robotyne direction, where the Russians have managed to advance in the direction of the Ukrainian fortified positions northeast of the village. This comes as a follow-up to the Russians capturing the fortified positions north of Robotyne and leaving the other one in the gray zone. The Ukrainians were forced to withdraw from it, but they have been able to prevent the Russians from capturing it. The Russians moving on to the next line of defense indicates that the Russians are moving on to gain control and elevate the front line. Aligning it along the fortified positions, it would create a strong springhold for the Russians to either continue defending this northern section of the Surovikin line or push towards Novodanilivka. We've seen positional fighting along the central parts of the Zaporizhia front, but no significant push by the Russians. The main efforts took place where the Russians wanted to recapture Robotyne, but now that they have Robotyne under their control, they are slowly pushing in small assaults across to regain the final parts of the pocket, regain it under their control to recreate the position they had prior to the Ukrainian summer offensive. In the next section of the front line, the Russians have managed to gain a foothold on the outskirts of Kostiantynivka. They have not entered the town yet. They've managed to capture the forest lines to the east of it and the fortified position of the Ukrainians east of the town. And with this, they have aligned the front line to the east and to the southeast of the town. It is likely that the Russians will push further southwest of Kostiantynivka, similar to what they did in Novomikhailivka, where they aligned the front line to the south of the town, cutting it off from supplies from the south and widening the front towards the town itself. At the same time, they are also likely going to push here west of Pereskovivka towards the Ukrainian fortified positions north of the town and from the Pobieda direction down south towards Kostiantynivka. This will create a wide front to the north, east, and south of Kostiantynivka ahead of an operation into it, just as they did with Novomikhailivka. Kostiantynivka is very similar to Novomikhailivka. The difference is it is less fortified to the south and more fortified to the north. It is smaller but wider. This means that the Russian artillery would be more effective on Kostiantynivka than at Novomikhailivka, and the southern flank is more vulnerable. However, with a stronger northern flank, the Ukrainians are still in a good position. The interesting part is that it is connected through 3 roads to the north, west, and south. The Russians are very close proximity-wise to the northern and southern road, which means that it is under direct Russian fire control. The rear road between Kostiantynivka and Katerinivka is beyond the line of sight of the Russians, but it is within artillery range, which means that Kostiantynivka is already somewhat operationally encircled, as it is very limited how much supplies can go in and out of the town with the close proximity of the Russians to the town. But it is essentially just the same situation as the Russians are by Novomikhailivka, as there's no significant supply line completely out of the line of sight of the Ukrainians. To the south of Novomikhailivka, there is a far enough distance for the Ukrainians to be unable to directly see the supply road, but it would still be within artillery range, just like the western road of Kostiantynivka. So Novomikhailivka, Kostiantynivka is under the same situation as the Russians and the Ukrainians are in clear enough position to hit the supplies going in and out of both of these towns. This means it is limited how many soldiers both sides can commit to this battle, and will likely stretch out until either side get an overwhelming advantage. In the next section of the front line here to the southeast of Novoslivka Persha, the Russians have captured the rest of this forest area and are inching closer towards the town. Further north in direction of the Toretsk direction, the Russians have captured further fortified positions and secured the eastern flank of the apartment complex area and are slowly inching through the forest parts where heavy fighting is taking place ahead of the apartment complex area located right next to these next fortified positions of the Ukrainians, and the fighting will take place along this apartment complex area over the next days, as the Russians will continue pressing the Ukrainian positions, and a control over that will allow the Russians to align the front line to the next Ukrainian line of defense, and the fighting will reach that line instead of the intermediary position between the first and second lines of defense. In the next section of the front line near Rostelivka, the Russians have captured the final parts of the village and have expanded towards the Sukha River. Rostelivka was located between the Sukha River to the north and Bakhmutovka River to the west, and the Russians have now gained control over the entire area in between the river line to the next villages of Velorivka and Peresisne. With this, the Russians are closer to launching a new operation here in this section of the front line. They already have positions across the Sukha River here along the first line, where they are fighting over the Ukrainian fortified positions, and they also have a foothold across the Bakhmutovka River, both in the direction of Vasyukivka, Sakoivansetsi, and Fedorivka, and this allows Russians to develop the front line as long as they have the necessary units in the area to commit to such operations. So with this, the final chapter of Rostelivka has come about, and the Russians are moving on to the next section of the front line here in the Siversk front. In the north of that, the Ukrainians have recaptured a significant portion of the forest area along the Severodonetsk river line to the north of Belorivka. They have managed to have success along the forest area in the Serebrenki forest and are now expanding that success southwards. Following the capture of most of these fortified positions, they're able to consolidate their gains and move on in a southern direction along the river line to push towards the Russian positions in the area. These positions that the Ukrainians captured were likely already abandoned by Russian soldiers as they withdrew to their positions along the northern parts of Belorivka and the fortified positions in the Serebrenki forest area, and therefore the Ukrainians managed to capture a large portion without much resistance. It was likely mostly just FPV drones and artillery hitting their positions. In the northern section here, west of Chernipovivka, the Russians have made their own advance in over a significant portion of the front line, moving it closer to the villages of Nevske and Novosadove, and this marks the next part of the Russian operations here, and that is to align the entirety of the front along the Serbets river line before that they launch assaults towards Zarishne, Torske, Terny, and Polivka, and so on. The Russians seem to have attempted to push towards Terny and Yampolivka, but with heavy Ukrainian resistance, they were unable to reach the villages completely. With the first operation towards Terny, it ended up with the Ukrainians launching a strong flank to the south, recapturing positions east of Yampolivka. This forced the Russians to abandon their positions near Terny, as their southern flank was vulnerable, and therefore they withdrew eastwards and now are aligning the front line in a northern direction. This is to counteract the Ukrainian advantage. They first managed to recapture positions here east of Yampolivka, which strengthened their eastern flank of Yampolivka and the southern flank of the Russian incursion towards Terny. That means that they could have flanked their Russian positions from the south. The Russians, seeing that, managed to withdraw towards the east, avoiding any major Ukrainian operation here near Terny, but also lost them their positions along the village itself. Now this forced the Russians to rethink their strategy. Either they would be forced to continue this back and forth near Terny and Yampolivka, but the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome. Therefore, they are now attempting something different, and what they're attempting is pushing here west of Chernipovivka and southwest of Vovchansk in direction of Nevske and Novosadove, moving on and allowing the front line here along Nevske and Novosadove would expand the front line, and if the southern flank is vulnerable, there is no major issue for the Russians, as they'll be able to have the northern flank under their control. This means that they would not be cut off. So by widening the front, the Russians also improved their ability to take a hit during the offensive operations and still carry it on. And with this, we see the next section of the front line is here by Vovchansk, where the Ukrainians have been able to re-enter the northern parts of the Vovchansk town and are pushing towards cutting off the Russian positions by the aggregate plant from the center. The fighting is currently taking place here by the school area, and if the Ukrainians manage to capture that, then they'll be able to cut off the aggregate plant, which is what Ukrainian side has been claiming that they have done for a very long time, yet there's been no evidence of them doing so, and therefore we see that now they are actually getting close to such an operation. If they manage to push the Russians out of the aggregate plant, it would likely result on two things. First, to explain how these two things will come about, we have to explain the current situation. The Russians have a limited amount of soldiers in Vovchansk. These Russian soldiers are concentrated in three areas. We have the northern parts by the cemetery, we have the southern part by the aggregate plant, and then we have the northwestern part, which is at the entry of Vovchansk. Other than that, there are few soldiers spread around. This means that due to these concentration of troops, the Russian soldiers who aren't in these concentrations are far and few in between. This means that they are covering a wider area. This also means that the Ukrainians are able to push and recapture positions due to this lack of Russian troops. The Russians at these concentrated areas do not have enough troops either. This means that despite them being able to contest these positions, they are not pushing beyond, they're not advancing, they're not cutting off Ukrainian positions, and they're just barely holding on. The Russians have an easy fix for the current situation, and that is simply to send more troops into the meat grinder. However, I believe that the current situation is that the Russians want to be spread out for the effects and efficiency of Ukrainian artillery to be limited, while the Ukrainians are gathering enough troops to be able to advance, but thereby also taking more casualties from the Russian bombardment of their positions across the different areas. The Ukrainians have also three separate concentrations of troops in the southern area, by the apartment complex area, and to the east. All of these three positions are fighting off against a Russian concentration of troops, whether it is by the aggregate plant in the northwestern parts or in the cemetery area. So with this, we see that it is clear that the Russians are concentrating their troops where it is needed, but at the same time leaves other areas vulnerable. Now, if the Russians, for example, withdraw from the aggregate plant, they'll be able to secure this western part with what troops they have available, being able to move the concentration to this western part and securing their positions there. However, they are committed to holding the aggregate plant because it is more fortified. This means that the Ukrainian artillery is less effective by the aggregate plant than it would be in the residential area, similar to how the Ukrainians are concentrated by the apartment complex area because it is simply safer. Therefore, if the Ukrainians manage to safely and securely cut off Russian soldiers by the aggregate plant, the southern parts here by Vovchansk would be vulnerable and the Russians would likely withdraw from it or launch a counterattack, and either one of two things would happen. Either the Ukrainians will gain control over the central parts of Vovchansk and push the Russians to the outskirts, or the Russians will commit and send additional troops to restore the situation by the aggregate plant and secure the western parts, preventing further Ukrainian advantages from being gained through these operations. So that is pretty much what I expect to happen here in the Vovchansk direction. Either the Ukrainians succeed with an flanking maneuver and cut off Russian soldiers, or the Russians launch a counterattack and strengthen their positions in Vovchansk. And that is the final part of this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.